Hello, welcome to history revision session number whatever it is, and this time it is life in Nazi Germany. So we'll start off going through the women's lives, the children's lives in and outside of school, which includes the first two parts of Unit 4, Key Topic 4, which is the last one on the Germany course. That's another look at the same thing, essentially. So women had, in the 1920s, been treated rather well in a historical sense, in a European sense. The German women were as equal as anybody in Europe. Their life chances and their treatment was relatively good. Still not equal to men, because when is it ever? But it was a heck of a lot better than under the Kaiser. One example of that is the fame and wealth of people like Marlene Dietrich and the prevalence of women in the cabaret scene in the golden age of Weimar. So here's a couple of examples of how it changed when the Nazis came into power. Obviously, there were no votes under the Nazis, but in Weimar, Germany, women were able to vote at 20, just like the men. And they were able to go to university. And if you think about what else we've covered, they were allowed jobs, to be doctors and other professionals, lawyers, all of which changed when Hitler came to power. Because he wanted them to be wives and mothers, essentially, he would let them, before they were married, do jobs of certain nature, traditional women's jobs, teachers of small children, nursing. But because he wanted them at home, once they were married, to have and bring up children, he banned them from being teachers, doctors, civil servants. So that is about 250,000 people, women, who given up work within the first year of Hitler becoming leader. By 1937, they were banned from grammar schools too. So the amount of women going to higher education fell by, well, 2/3 really. And the women were expected to concentrate on the 3Ks. Now, the 3Ks, not to be mixed up with the KKK, very different thing, was Kinder, children, Küche, cooking, and Kirche, church, or Kirche. Don't speak German, as you can probably tell. Now, that was an idea, a traditional idea, well before the Nazis, from back under the Kaiser's time. But it suited Hitler. I mean, we all know Hitler had a somewhat delicate relationship with the church, and it was not plain sailing. But for this purpose, for women's rights, the 3Ks, because it's something that they could fall back on, that everybody knew about, was what was expected. Some comments made by Nazi leaders about the role of women in German society are, on those bullet points, essentially just reinforcing the fact that they're expected to be wives, mothers, and their main job, primary purpose, was having kids and bringing them up. But obviously, as long as they were Aryan. So one of the ways that Nazis, apart from the propaganda telling them this is what they wanted, could try and engender this was by bribery. So if you got married, you were given 1,000 marks, which I've done my homework and figured out is roughly around £30,000. So roughly an average year's wage, probably just above. But that was a loan unless you started having kids, which meant you would have to pay it back. But if you have kids, every kid you had, a quarter of that loan was wiped off, written off. You didn't have to pay it back. So obviously, if you had 2 kids, you didn't have to pay half of it back. If you had 4 kids, you got that as a gift to keep. Other things that women were expected to do or not do was not wear trousers. These are all things that they didn't do. They weren't expected to smoke, not because they knew the danger, but because it was unladylike. Have unnatural things in their hair, such as dye or perms. Wear high heels, because that's not what a mother would do. I'm not going to say what they thought the sort of woman who wore high heels would do. Anyway, if you think back to the picture of Marlene Dietrich at the start, they didn't want women looking like that. And they didn't want women to slim on purpose or diet. They felt the most attractive body was a motherly figure with childbearing hips. So to ensure that women were enabled to breed as well, they were allowed these sort of newspaper ads, such as this one where a man is looking for seems to be a young bride who was a virgin. Nazi leaflet sets out the ideology behind women, and Hitler even wrote a poem in 1923 that was published just after he became Chancellor about women through his, through the mother. Another form of bribery or encouragement for women to have children with the motherhood cross given out on Hitler's mother's birthday. I couldn't tell when that is, but a quick Google probably will. So 4 kids equals bronze, 6 kids equals silver, 8 kids equals gold, and if you were wearing one of those, you were well respected within the community and people would have to salute you, even SS officers. The woman appointed, and one of the few women high up in the Nazi party echelons, was Gertrude Schultz-Klink, and she was in charge of all women's policies. Do you know what? I don't know why I've got it on this. I'll go to that. So I might actually have to go back to share this again. Okay. Hopefully you were up to speed with all that. Now we're in the better format for this revision podcast. So she unified all the women's groups, the women's institutes and stuff, into the German Women's Enterprise, or DWF in German. Don't know what that would stand for. Deutsche something, Frau, something possibly. Now, this was interesting because there were, probably because of World War One, more women than men, and therefore there were some Aryan women who were unable to get married because there weren't enough men. So what they could do to fulfill their Nazi goal was to go and get impregnated at a Lebensborn, which was sort of a cross between a brothel and an orphanage, where the high-ranking SS officers, well, I think any SS officer could go and impregnate an Aryan woman and then leave and never have anything to do with them again, and the young woman would have hell bringing up that child by the Lebensborn. That's where the orphanage bit comes in. Now, excuse me, I think there's a good possibility that I might sneeze. No, it's gone. Okay, so obviously Hitler didn't want them to work, but as more and more men were put into the army and as more and more men were killed in World War II, so it's from about 1936 really that this started. Women were put to work in the factories. He didn't really want them working in weapons and munitions factories, although they did by the end. And then when the war started, and by the end of the war, they were actually even firing anti-aircraft guns and being nurses. So were Nazi policies towards women successful? You can see not totally, because he had to allow them to go back to work. And all throughout, there were women who didn't really buy into the Nazi ideology, including Traudl Junge, who said Gertrude Scholz-Klink was not her cup of tea. They didn't buy into it. I'm going to do that. So recap. Employment, Nazis wanted women to stay at home, be mothers. Parents, they should be natural, and they should have as many kids as possible. Therefore, their job was to be at home, not to work. Okay, moving on to the youth in Nazi Germany. Well, they were really important to Hitler because he believed that this Nazi Third Reich, as they called it, was going to last for 1,000 years. So it didn't really matter to him whether everybody believes, as long as they didn't outwardly protest, but as long as he got children on side, then the future was staved. For that's not the right word. The future was going to be fine for the Nazis. This is what Hitler said about them. My magnificent youngsters, with them I can make a new world. My teaching is hard. Weakness has been knocked out of them. He wants them to grow up a violent, masterful, brave, cruel younger generation. And he also said, your children are mine already. What are you? In time you will die, but your sons and daughters will stand forever in my new Germany. In a short time, they'll know nothing else except this new Germany. And he was, to an extent, right. It is easier to indoctrinate children because they hadn't had the years of experience to form their own opinions. And so when they were told constantly about Hitler's opinions and Hitler's ideology, they were more likely to believe it. Just the same as if you do a magic trick on a kid. It's easier to fool them than it is to fool an adult. They're more naive, let's put it that way. Less cynical. Now, all children had to go to school. So one way that he could ensure that they were listening to his ideas was through the education system. And he made sure all teachers were joining the Nazi Teachers League. And if they didn't, most of them, I think all the teachers were in the Nazi Teachers League, 99.9% of them, the rest was sacked. And then the curriculum was changed. Some of it obvious, German history only, German language only, but some of it less obvious, science, for example. But you could twist that so it was about warfare and ballistics. Do loads of PE because more than anything he wanted men to be able to fight, so they needed to be physically fit. Even maths could be subverted into Nazi ideology, as you can see from these maths puzzles. You could be expelled for failing physical tests. Jews weren't allowed to go after a certain date. I think that's 1935, although I believe actually took place a little bit later. Even before that, they were named and shamed, like this kid in the picture, in front of the other kids. So it can't have been a nice experience for them, even when they were allowed to go to school. And they even had some sort of, like, I suppose, grammar schools, but for Nazis, they're really for the high flyers. The first one, Adolf Hitler schools, were run actually by the Hitler Youth themselves, not necessarily by the youth of Hitler Youth, but by the same people who run the Hitler Youth, adults who were in charge of it, and they trained them in really harsh conditions to be leaders. Napolas are similar. These are for the political or military leaders, and they were like boarding schools. There's a film called Napola, which is quite brutal. And yes, tough entrance exams, and 1 in 5 failed because they couldn't send them, of course, because of exhaustion. And then if they managed to get through those two, they could go to the Nazi university, which is called Order Castles, where they were actually using live ammunition when they were doing their war training. At every school, there was a emphasis, like we said, on sport. 4 hours of sport each day. You can tell this is a girls' time, because girls had different curriculum with more about race to it, so they could learn how to find a pure Aryan partner. Domestic science rather than ballistics, for example, and the science of breeding, which is more about how to make sure your baby's up. Bernhard Russ was in charge of education, but outside the classroom, there was also continued indoctrination through the Hitler Youth or the League of German Maidens, and there was other groups for younger kids as well, but these are the main two: Hitler Youth for boys and League of German Maidens for girls. So they'd been called like scouts with knives, and they were to an extent. So you could get a Hitler Youth Achievement Award, like a Scouts badge, but you had to do all of these things, which was finding out about German Hitler, doing your athletic tests, and doing a hike, as well as target practice. They were all given a knife. Leaders of those two were Baldur von Schirach and, again, Gertrude Torch-Klink. She's in charge of all the women's stuff. And you can see from this table that the membership grew quite quickly. And by 1939, by 1936, the membership was compulsory. But in 1939, almost all you can see from membership compared to the actual population in Germany were members of the Hitler Youth or the League of German Maidens. And they would do all these sort of things. We talked about hiking before, we talked about propaganda, and they even did the opening ceremony or part of it for the 1936 Olympics. They went collecting for the Nazi Party with their tins, team building activity, gymnastics. It was part fun, part drilling for war, and for that reason, some people absolutely loved it, and some pupils absolutely hated it. Their pupils, they weren't really pupils, young people, let's call them. And just like the women, as the war progressed, they were commandeered into it too. If you've ever seen the end of Jojo Rabbit, you'll know that they were fighting grown Russian soldiers in the Battle of Berlin. And that wasn't much of an exaggeration, because here they are putting out fires, firing machine guns. So, on to the next bit, which is the economy. Hermann Goering said, would you rather have, do you know what it is? It's guns or butter, because he was trying to make the point that, well, I'll say it in a second. Hitler said, anyone who sees and paints the sky green and feels blue ought to be sterilised, but this is what I was really getting at. Guns will make us powerful, butter will only make us fat. He's trying to persuade the German people that they need to forego luxuries and focus on stuff they need to get back their respect after losing it in World War One. So what did Hitler do? He wanted to drag Germany out of world depression, because there was 6 million Germans unemployed by 1932, and so, but the first two can be doing the same thing: make Germany an autarky so it's self-sufficient, get them ready for war, which factors into all of the above. And then one more of a side effect, really, of this would be that, or a way of achieving it would be confiscating Jewish businesses and giving to the Aryans. So did he have success? Well, yes, because the creation of the autobahns, drafting men into the army, making more munitions in factories, all did give men jobs. So it solved unemployment. Banning strikes meant that there was lots of productivity. So Germany was dragged out of world depression because they didn't have a choice. People couldn't claim unemployment, they get sent to a camp. And you can see how the unemployment falls. But it's worth noting that these figures don't include Jews whose businesses were taken off them or forced out of their jobs, or women who were forced out of their jobs. So the figures look slightly better than they actually were. Because women, obviously, if they're a mother in a home, they're in a job, so they're not counted in the unemployment figures. In 1934, Hitler employed somebody called Hjalmar Schacht, who wasn't actually a Nazi, as an economist, to come up with this new plan. And then from 1937, one of his henchmen, Goering, took over with his 4-year plan. The new plan was to reduce imports, to make Germany produce more of its own stuff, reduce unemployment, which we've seen, and spend money and taxes on a wide range of industry, but still make agreements with other nations. And so making Germany an autarky means that they don't have to have trade at all. So that's more to do with Hermann Goering's 4-year plan. And Hitler wanted to make sure that he wasn't going to rely on other countries, because that's what had been the case in World War One, and all Britain had to do is park their battleships outside German ports, and the Germans would go without things and eventually starve, and that's what led them to lose really in World War One. So Hitler wasn't going to let that happen. So Goering's plan, 4-year plan, was to achieve this and at the same time make Germany into a war machine. Autarky couldn't be fully realised because there are some things they couldn't make. For example, oil and synthetic rubber. You can see their attempt there. And one of the contradictions in his economic policy is that he was really interested in making sure the farmers were happy, partly because farmers were one of the first groups to support him, and partly because he believed they had something special because they're the ones who are getting their hands in German soil, and German soil is special. So he tried to get them to produce less so that it drove food prices up so that they were better off, but it meant that there was less food for the German people. So it went against autarky, and Germany still imported 30% of its raw materials by 1939 when the war started. He did get Germany ready for war. You can see the increase in spending, 1.9 million marks in the army up to 32.3 million marks in 6 years. And then when the war started, they could steal resources from other countries, including slave labour. From 1943, Germany went total war, and working hours went up, but our course really finishes in 1939. They did take Aryan Jewish businesses off Jews and give them to Aryans, more so after the Kristallnacht, but right from the start. For example, this guy Fritz Stepan is an international footballer, was given, when he retired from football, a Jewish business. So there was certain success in the German economy, but it wasn't all success. One of the things they managed to do was to get rid of trade unions as part of Hitler's first year as Chancellor before he even became Führer. And he replaced this with the German Labour Front, or the DAF, which had a lot of different parts to it, which we'll go through now. The first part, well, this is the German Labour Front itself, was run by Dr. Robert Ley, made strikes illegal, removed working hour restrictions. So not really doing what trade union would do. You couldn't get a job in Nazi Germany without being a member of this. It's compulsory, pretty much. But it did actually provide some protections for workers, because the bosses weren't allowed to sack you on the spot. The first part is the one on the right, is the Reich Labour Service, which had sections for men and women, but it was mainly for young men who were unemployed, and they would be given a job for no pay, or very little pay, just an allowance really, but they got their accommodation and their food for free. And there was a lot of propaganda. It's almost like the once you'd done the Hitler Youth, you graduated to this, and the propaganda and feeling of all doing something for Nazi Germany together was very prevalent. Another aspect was the beauty of labour, which is the propaganda wing of the German Labour Front, or the DAF. And they were, on the one hand, trying to prove to people that they were trying to get better working conditions for them, but on the other hand, saying how great it is to work for the fatherland, they would have called it. And probably the most famous part of it was the Strength Through Joy, which was the nectar point scheme, really, of Nazi Germany. You could build up stamps for doing extra work, and those could be put towards free stuff, like radios and holidays and sporting events, stuff like that. You can see on the right, because Hitler realised when he did all the maths and took away sleeping time, working time, all that sort of stuff, that the average German would still have 3,740 leisure hours free a year to fill, and he didn't want them getting any ideas about protesting. He wanted to keep them busy so they would be happy and that they wouldn't have time to think about what was not so good with their lives. So overall, the German people were provided for in different ways. Again, not universally popular, particularly the Reich Labour Front, the Reich Labour Service yet, because some men resented the fact that they had to do that, weren't given a proper wage. So overall success, unemployment dropped radically, wages went up slightly, initially anyway. Germany did get out of depression. The Strength Through Joy was generally popular because getting free stuff, and the DAF, the Reich Labour Service, was popular with some, if they bought into the propaganda. But on the other hand, working hours did go up, especially after the war, from 1936 onwards, anyway, and less rights because there's no trade unions, fewer consumer goods because guns not butter, remember, and actually Germany borrowed a hell of a lot of money to pay for all this, so they were in debt. Some questions that you need to be able to answer there, and on the Strength Through Joy as well. But I will let you pause that if you want to do those. I'll move on to the minorities. So you all know that is Shropshire's finest, Charles Darwin. And you probably don't know, unless you're in my lesson and I taught it, that this is his, I think it's either his cousin or his nephew, Francis Galton, who applied Charles Darwin's survival of the fittest in terms of species to races where it doesn't work. Remember that the species have to take hundreds of thousands, not millions of years to evolve. He tried to apply it to race in a short period of time to try to persuade people that the white people were better. And Hitler bought into that theory of what was called eugenics. And he had strong views on who was allowed in his Volksgemeinschaft, or people's community. And those who fit in were generally Aryan. And the traditional view of Aryanism or Aryans is that they are blonde hair, blue eyed, tall, very strong, and he called that the master race. In reality, as we know, because Hitler himself is dark haired, I don't think he had blue eyes either. But there was a range of different people, as long as they could trace their ancestry back to the northern part of Africa, I think. And it wasn't just Aryans, it was people who were closely related to Aryans, English people, for example, because they were Anglo-Saxons originally, came from Germany. He was quite scientific in a pseudoscience sort of way behind it. He'd had explanations. He didn't just go, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, I like you. I don't like you because I don't like look at you. There was some rationalisation of it. And so you got like this league table almost where the Aryans are in the Champions League spots, and with the blonde hair blue eyes right at the top, and then you've got these that are actually mid-table, and then you've got people who didn't fit in and were excluded from the people's community in the relegation zone. Now, don't get mistaken for the people who were Aryan who went against him, like the White Rose group and some church members and the Edelweiss Pirates and Swingers and Jazzers. Those were Aryan and could have been if they wanted to, they chose not to. These are the ones who might want to be part of Jim's people's community, but were excluded. And the main one, obviously, the Jews, whose treatment slowly got worse. I mean, it started off bad, but got a lot worse. And I've put the line in there because World War II, we don't actually go past 1939, but it did get a lot worse after 1939. So here's a few things that happened. Initially, there's boycott shops and judges being sacked. Then by 1935, Jews forbidden to join the army, and shortly after the Nuremberg laws, which go into a bit more detail. Slight relaxation because of the Olympics, and they didn't want people cottoning on. But then it got worse with Kristallnacht in 1938. So boycotting the shops was the brown shirts, back when the brown shirts, before they'd been culled in the night, the long knives, stood outside putting posters on saying don't go in there, it belongs to a Jew. Not nice, but nowhere near the final solution and the Holocaust. Nuremberg laws, again, this is the kind of pseudoscience that Hitler was basing his racial theory on. It was about how many of your grandparents had to be Jewish for you to be considered Jewish or Aryan. And essentially, if you had 3 or 4, you were definitely Jewish. Gets a bit more complicated if you had 1 or 2, they were Mishlings, but so probably definitely persecuted. Whether they actually all got sent to the death camps, well, it depends on lots of factors, like whether they were practicing Jewish, whether people knew they were Jewish, whether they looked Jewish. Can you look Jewish? Yeah, you can, but disabled people are part of this group as well. Even if they were Aryan, they were not part of the people's community because Hitler wanted a clean gene pool, as he called it, and they were eventually put to death, starting with the children and then onto the adults. Other people that were the Untermensch, underclass, undesirables, all words you could use in an exam, were black people, gypsies, the half-bloods, mixed bloods. Half-bloods a Harry Potter thing, isn't it? Poles, Russians, and Slavs. Particularly Southern Poles. The other undesirables, again, most of these were Aryan, but they were still because of their life. No, that's not right. But some of them because of their choices, but not homosexuals. Because of their, how do I put this without being offensive? Just people who were Aryan that were not part of the community. Sometimes because of choices that they made, like criminals, alcoholics, pacifists, tramps and beggars. And they all were different coloured triangles when they were put in concentration camps and later on death camps. That's the same thing, just a little bit clearer with English writing. So by 1938, it had got really violent. I mean, there was violence against Jews before then, but it wasn't state-sponsored, and the police might not have done anything about it because they were run by the SS, but it wasn't done by them. After a German ambassador was killed in Paris by a Jew, the brown shirts actually brought back for this went on the rampage. Hitler said it was a German people, but it wasn't. It was his own private army, and they smashed up Jewish shops, synagogues, homes. 91 people were killed, loads more sent to the camps. Even more thought, now this is the time that we will go to another country, and a lot went to Poland. And that was the guy who got killed, and that was the guy who killed him. Some people, but most historians believe that it wasn't Hitler who came up with this, but it was Goebbels' idea, who'd actually fallen out of favour with Hitler at that particular point and wanted something that would make Hitler happy, so came up with it. And by 1939, the Nazis were now trying to force Jews out of Germany. They did come up with a plan to send them to Madagascar, but the British said no, because we didn't know what was going to happen. And then World War II broke out, and it was more difficult to force the Jews out. They inherited 3 million more Jews, and that's pretty much where our course ends. But obviously, just for your knowledge, you should know about the ghettos that the Jews are put in cities in Poland, which the Jews did rise up against, but were brutally put down if they didn't. If they did, then the Nazis invaded other countries in Europe and sent in the Einsatzgruppen to destroy Jews. It's horrible, sorry, to kill Jews. As they went into these countries, which was using up too many bullets and being too slow. So they decided to come up with a final solution. They looked at lots of methods like gas vans, and eventually settled on Zyklon B. Played out the ghettos. If you've ever seen Schindler's List, you'll remember that scene. And then this guy was required, the most famous death camp, to decide who was going to live and who was going to die within the next few minutes. That's a gas chamber where they were put to death, and 6 million to 10 million Jews and other undesirables were slaughtered on an industrial scale for the next 3 years. Even when the war looked like it was certain to be over, they abandoned the camps and took them on death marches. It was horrendous. I have been to Auschwitz. I recommend anybody go. It's not a nice place to visit, but it's well worth it. So you only really need to know up to 1939 for the exam, but I think it was worth going through. I'm sure you've done it in lesson before, but it seems wrong to do about the Jews and not mention what ultimately happened to them, even though it's not going to be on your exam. It's a very serious note to end on, but I am going to end there because that is the end of the revision session. So thank you for watching. This week's secret word, in case you have seen this and want to prove it to me, is Eric Cantona. And I have no idea why, but it is. So come up to me and say, oh, that Eric Cantona, he were a good player, weren't he? I love his Kung Fu kick. And on that note, I will bid you, as Eric would, adieu.